Hi, everybody, and welcome to a Greenberg study event. Uh, this conversation is meant to celebrate and flesh out and bring to the fore the work of our guest, Professor Maurice Samuels, who came to us from Yale University, where he chairs the department. So he specializes in the literature and culture of the 19th century French. He's interested in investigating the origins of our cultural modernity, tracing how forms of subjectivity and ideas about history, politics, race, and the novel took shape in the period following the French Revolution. So he's the author of 5 books. The first is The Spectacular Past, Popular History and the Novel in 19th Century France, that was published by Cornell University Press in 2004. The second book that he authored is Inventing the Israelite, Jewish Fiction in 19th Century France, that came out with Stanford University Press in 2010. The third one is The Right to Different, French Universalism and the Jews. So that was with Chicago University Press in 2016. Followed by The Betrayal of the Duchess, 2020 with Basic. He co-edited 19th century Jewish literature Reader, Stanford, 2013. His most recent book is a biography of Alfred Dreyfus that came out with Yale in 2024. So I want to thank the Greenberg Center, Mark and Mike for organizing this. Also, our very own department of Romance Languages that brought it to us, and Quentin, so thank you all. And what we'll do today is kind of, again, talk about Professor Samuel's work by me introducing him by my question. So I will now introduce myself. My name is Orit. I'm a professor of modern Middle Eastern and Jewish history in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. And in my own field, studying Middle Eastern communities, studying Middle Eastern Jewish communities, there's a lot of influence of precisely the same things that Professor Samuel's study. So, the products of the press, the historical novel that assumes great popularity. And there are actually novels about, ancient Israelites in Arabic, in Hebrew, produced at this period. In the Middle East also, because of the Jewish context and because of the colonial context and the Jewish context, I think that there's much more French influence than German influence when we think about the Ashkenazi context. So because of the Alliance schools, because of the colonization of Algeria, because Egypt and the Ottoman Empire send scientific missions to France on almost a yearly basis since the beginning of the 20th century, the 19th century, the presence of French culture is very, very dominant. And so what I would like to do in this conversation is kind of go back and forth. So I will present some questions about French culture seen in my context. I'll address them to Professor Samuels, and he'll try to address them coming back from the French context and kind of doing this kind of global conversation to again flesh out Professor Samuel's rich scholarship, the archives he's using. So thank you so much for agreeing to do that. So my first question is about the Dreyfus affair, and sort of your Alfred Dreyfus. And I'm asking that because, again, in the Middle East, this is a major event. Not and not so much in 1894, but by 1898, a lot of people are writing on it in Hebrew, in Arabic, in Ottoman Turkish. And it becomes kind of a platform to discussing a lot of things, whether it's the failure of French republicanism and secularism, whether it's a testimony for the hypocrisy of France, that kind of preaches to the Jew, to the world, how to, especially the Muslim world, how to treat its Jews and Christians, where they treat their own Jews in an appalling fashion. It's considered a moment of great disappointment to the Jews who are products of the Alliance Israélite Universelle system. And so it becomes like a platform upon which a lot of people project their whataboutism with respect to France, their anxieties from global anti-Semitism. So thinking about your own work, can you tell us about your own Dreyfus affair, your own research, how it kind of intersects with your own interest in like the French public sphere and its print products, and also if you can sort of reflect on like why this scandal in particular becomes so global, because there are other scandals that they're actually writing about in the press at the time, the Shoda and the Panama and all sorts of, but this one is something else. So
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those great questions. I have a lot to say, but first, thank you also for inviting me, Orit, and thank you to the Quentin from the French Cultural Studies Workshop, and Mark, and also hello to Betsy and Dale Pinkert, who I think sponsored this, who are friends of my family, they said they were watching. So hello. Okay, so the Dreyfus affair. One thing that has always struck me about the Dreyfus affair is that you can have a completely different understanding of what it meant depending on where you're situated. So you could see it as a horrible moment of anti-Semitism, as you said, but you could also see it as the triumph of French liberal institutions. So let me flesh that out a little bit, but maybe it might help to say just a little bit first about the Dreyfus affair itself, in case people, everyone's heard of it, but maybe people aren't totally up to speed. So this was a case that started in 1894 when a Jewish officer in the French army was falsely accused of selling military secrets to Germany. He was found guilty after a 3-day court-martial based on very little evidence that was not shown to his lawyers, which was a violation of even military justice. He was found guilty, sent to Devil's Island, this horrible penal colony off the coast of South America, to begin serving a life sentence. Meanwhile, back in France, his family, his wife and brother, set out to prove his innocence. And they were starting, it was an impossible task because they had, how do you prove that someone didn't do something? And they had no one on their side. Everyone turned their backs on them. It was very difficult. So they eventually were able to uncover who the real traitor was and a few other things about that showed Dreyfus's innocence. They gradually won more and more people over to their side to become Dreyfusards, as they were called, and including some prominent intellectuals, such as the famous novelist Émile Zola, who publishes a famous article, does anyone know, Jacques Ellul, in 1898, that basically blows the lid off the case. At that point, it's really the affair, properly speaking, is in full bloom. France is completely divided, on the verge of civil war. It's basically becoming more and more clear that he was innocent. They petition to overturn the original verdict. They bring him back from Devil's Island to stand trial a second time in 1899. If the first trial was only 3 days, this one goes on for several weeks. It's a huge media spectacle. and he's found guilty again, even though it's obvious that he was innocent. But the army couldn't admit that they had made a mistake. But at this point, it's an international scandal for France and other countries who were uniformly pro-Dreyfus, including Tsarist Russia and Germany, who knew that he was innocent because they knew who the real traitor was. So they are threatening to boycott the 1900 World's Fair in Paris, and the French eventually, to avoid that, give him a pardon. He accepts the pardon, even though his hardcore supporters don't want him to, but on the condition that he can keep fighting to clear his name. And eventually in 1906, he's completely exonerated. So that's the thumbnail sketch of the affair. So I was asked to write a biography of Dreyfus for the Jewish Lives series at Yale University Press, which, if you know the series, they're supposed to be short, readable biographies. It's not so easy to write a short biography about the Dreyfus Affair, which is incredibly complicated. And I also didn't know what I could really add at first, because I think after the French Revolution, it's the next most written about event in French history. So there's an enormous bibliography about it. And I started to read a lot of those books and eventually realized that people hadn't really focused on the Jewish dimension of the affair. Of course, everyone mentions that he's Jewish, but it's rarely the focus of the scholarship. So I decided for my Jewish life of Dreyfus, I was going to focus on what Jewishness meant for him and his family. And I'm happy to talk about that more because it's not what I think most people think. Also, the role of anti-Semitism in the case, which some scholars say was ancillary, but I show was really central to every aspect of the case, including, to answer your question, why this case became a global affair. I think it was because of his Jewishness, and I can come back to that. And then the third part of what I tried to do was to ask what Dreyfus's life meant for the lives of Jews around the world. Although when I say around the world, I didn't really do the Middle East. So that's why I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. I limited it to partly to the languages I read, although I did hire some grad students to help me with the Hebrew and Yiddish newspapers, because I don't read those languages. But I really focused it on Jewish communities where they had a newspaper. And those are helpfully all on the National Library of Israel website, and searchable, which was great. So I really looked at the coverage and how the Dreyfus Affair was covered in these Jewish newspapers in mainly in German, French, Hebrew, and Yiddish. So both in Europe and the United States. And what I found was that, and this goes back to what I started by saying, which is that the Dreyfus Affair was totally key, central for the developing ideology of Zionism, which was taking shape in exactly those years when the Dreyfus Affair was playing out. And it was totally central for kind of on the opposite end of the Jewish ideological spectrum for what I call the integrationist Jews, the Jews who were mostly middle or class or higher, and who thought that Jews should remain loyal citizens of their countries. So the affair was crucial to both of those groups for opposite ways. So each side saw in the affair what they wanted to see. So for the Zionists, they saw the affair as you said, I think this is similar to what it sounds like the Middle Eastern take on the affair was, which is this was a moment of horrible anti-Semitism. The affair showed that even in enlightened France, this is what can happen. So even the most integrated Jew, like Dreyfus, who's risen to the top level of the French army, even someone like him is not safe. And, they pointed to, after Zola published J'accuse, there was basically a year of anti-Semitic pogroms in France. Like every 69 French cities had violent demonstrations against Jews, and in most of those cities there were no Jews. And including, and the worst violence was in colonial Algeria, where people were killed, actually. So that's what the Zionists pointed to as proof that Jews would not be safe anywhere, need a homeland of their own. But the integrationists they kind of minimized that part of the affair and looked to the happy conclusion that, okay, it all worked out in the end, that French institutions were tested, but they didn't break, and they eventually did uphold liberal universalist values, and that was their conclusion. So it was very interesting that you could see whatever you wanted to see in the affair.
So I just have a few follow-up questions. So first, when you research like Dreyfus's own family and kind of his own Jewish origins, which archives do you visit? And then the second question is like, if you can explain to us a little bit about the process. So again, you're reading the press, you're reading Herzl, you're reading the accounts from the report, from the trial. And then so many people have written about it, so many Jews, right? Orit and Herzl, and so many non-Jews, Zola, so how do you kind of distill your own voice when you're kind of taking a bird's eye view of the trial and the Jewishness of Dreyfus? Since again in the context that I know, it goes to different directions. So at one point there's fascination with Dreyfus, but then there's also fascination with Zola and the birth of the intellectual. We see this also with the Zionist movement, like Snus Sheff later on goes to Paris to interview Zola. One of the intellectuals that I study, Esther Moyal, is writing a biography in Arabic of Emile Zola, so it goes this direction. Then there is, as you said, the Zionists and the assimilationist voices. Then there are other people who are generally interested in what's happening in France at the time from a global perspective. So how do you kind of analyze this whole mess of information?
Yeah. So, well, first on Dreyfus's Jewishness, there was one book that was very helpful by an American scholar named Burns that was written maybe in the early 90s, called Dreyfus, I think a Family Affair, I think it's called. And he had done a lot of research, which was helpful. But I was able to draw on also this collection of materials related to the affair that was recently given by the Dreyfus family to the Jewish Museum in Paris. So just a few years ago, and it's a big collection. And that was really interesting for me because so people say, the kind of conventional line on Dreyfus, or the assumption about him, is that he was an assimilated Jew. And Arendt, for instance, in the Origins of Totalitarianism, has a big section on the Dreyfus affair. And she's really, in that book, most of you probably know, is really laying into the Jews of Europe, basically saying that they were unprepared for the Holocaust because they had surrendered their Jewish identity in the rush to assimilate. And she actually names Dreyfus as a key exemplar of that attitude. And I tried to show in the book that it's really, I think, a misunderstanding of what Jewishness meant for Dreyfus and his family, and of the specific nature of Franco-Judaism. So of the specific kind of Jewish identity that took shape in France in the 19th century. So what I found was, and including looking at this collection given by his family, that they were practicing Jews. Dreyfus himself was not a religious person, so he was a rationalist and a scientist, but his wife was practicing, and the collection had her book of Hebrew prayers that she clearly used, and in the back it had the dates of the yard sites of family members written in her hand. Also, the collection had yard site calendars so they could know when to go to synagogue. The first letter that his wife Lucy, and I should say by the way, Lucy, Dreyfus's wife, is a huge heroine of the affair, and she really doesn't get her due. I mean, she was 25 years old when this happened, had led a very sheltered life, and then really rose to the occasion and basically not only fought for his innocence, but basically kept him alive with her letters. She was a very smart, cultivated person. And but as I said, she was very practicing. The family attended the Orthodox synagogue of Paris, the main synagogue. They were married by the chief rabbi of France, who was a friend of the family. Everyone in their family married other Jews. Both their children married other Jews. So I say in the book, to me, that is not a sign of assimilation. If by assimilation you mean what I think it means, which is surrendering your Jewish identity to take on the majority culture, I think what they exemplify is acculturation. They were very acculturated Jews, but they really saw their Jewishness as going hand in hand with their Frenchness. So it was not a contradiction for them, because the France that they passionately identified with was the France of the French Revolution, this universalist France, which was the first country that emancipated Jews during the French Revolution, and they felt intensely grateful to that and loyal. So they were, I would say, discrete Jews in a sense, but they were not assimilated Jews, as I think Arendt says. So the second, sorry, that was a long-winded answer, and I've now forgotten the second part of the question, which was.
Okay.
Okay.
I just two quick follow-ups. So one is like, you worked on other scandals, you published a book on another scandal. So I was wondering if you could talk, what does a scandal do for a historian that wants to engage with phenomena like integration, assimilation, and alteration? Because on the one hand, the scandal kind of neatly divides the intellectual field. So you have pro-Dreyfus and anti-Dreyfus. But yet it's not sort of an expression of everyday life, right? It becomes everyday life. So what is the kind of and again it draws a lot of journalists. So what are the benefits of focusing on a scandal such a scandal to understand? So what are the limitations?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the book before this, The Betrayal of the Duchess, which was about a scandal where the son of the chief rabbi of France.
But I'm
Yeah.
thinking also about the Dreyfus affair
Yeah,
as a scandal as well.
Yeah, as a scandal, no, exactly, both of those, yeah. And so in The Betrayal of the Duchess, it was about the son of the chief rabbi of France who betrayed the Duchesse de Berry in 1832, and that led to really, I think, the first outpouring of the first anti-Semitic affair in modern France in 1892. But I think what these scandals show is they become moments when ideological features get brought out more concretely and intensely, I think. And I think they also are moments when, because of that, it kind of forces the sides to coalesce around it. So in that earlier scandal in 1832, I argue that was a moment when it became clear that anti-Semitism would be a feature of right-wing discourse in France. And it, it really helped divide the left and the right in France more concretely. And Jews became, to borrow what Shulamit Volkov calls it, anti-Semitism became a kind of cultural code for understanding and for dividing, for sorting French political life. And I think that the Dreyfus Affair does the same thing. So beginning in the French Revolution, there's a kind of divide in French society. It's between the left and the right, basically, people for the values of the French Revolution and people against it. And this is this kind of civil war that is bubbling below the surface in France and then occasionally bubbles to the surface. And the Dreyfus Affair was one of those moments, one of the main moments when that happens, I would say.
Okay, so for the Dreyfus Affair, and that kind of we pivot to another kind of product of the book, but also of the research more generally, which is sort of French anti-Semitism. And it's interesting that in the Middle East, when they write about the Dreyfus Affair, but also when they write about, different lives of Jewish philanthropists, like the or businessmen, the newspapers like the Rothschilds or Baron Hirsch or the Sassoons in Iraq. The newspaper that stands out as the most anti-Semitic is a newspaper called Al Bashir that is sponsored by French missionaries. But you're studying sort of French anti-Semitism, and here I wonder again, thinking about the global context, how much of French anti-Semitism is a global phenomenon in the sense that, like, the tropes that are there, the binaries between the Semitic and the Aryan and the Jewish cosmopolitanism and the inability of the Jew to integrate into public service and be loyal and Jewish global dominations. All of them kind of travel around, and then people like Gobineau and others are actually translate them into other languages and influence Chamberlain and things like that. So we can actually see that there's like almost like a chain of anti-Semitism that where the myths and the narratives move. And we just had a talk last week about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that also originated in some way from the French text, although not an anti-Semitic text. So there's this global component, and again in the Middle East, when they write about the Dreyfus Affair, one of the Islamists called it, he said now the global disease has arrived to us. But at the same time, in your own scholarship, it's also very, very grounded in France itself, right? So the politics, the French Revolution, the print culture, class tension. So thinking again about the portrayal of the judges, your work on Dreyfus, your other work, like how do you kind of settle this tension and this ideology? And I guess you can ask it about Russia and Germany and other spaces as well, but I just wonder from your own work.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. And I also at Yale, I run this program to study anti-Semitism. And so we sponsor a lot of talks and so it's something I've been thinking about a lot, and all the more, I would say, since, for the last few years for obvious reasons. And so, I would say there's a debate in anti-Semitism studies, a kind of basic debate over whether anti-Semitism is the longest hatred, something that is basically the same thing, the same germ in all times and places, then, it just keeps, it just gets passed along, or whether it's radically new in different contexts, and whether we shouldn't even call it the same thing, and so there's a whole debate, should we even call what was happening before the 19th century anti-Semitism, because, that word was coined only in the 1870s. And should we even call what is happening now on college campuses, for instance, anti-Semitism, or is it something else? So that's a big debate. And, of course, I think like a lot of debates, there's truth on both sides of that. So I think that certainly there are common features to anti-Semitism in different, especially I would say in different geographic contexts, partly because the role in society that Jews play is somewhat similar in these different contexts, I would say. But there are also big differences. And a lot of my work, I think, has been more on that side, showing the specificity of French anti-Semitism. So, of course, many things, about it are similar to what was happening in Germany, unsurprisingly. But there are also unique features because of the unique nature of French history, of French political culture, of the specific history and the specific sociology of Jews in France. It makes it very specific. And, as I was saying, to cite Shulamit Folkov again, anti-Semitism, her theory is that anti-Semitism functions as a cultural code, allowing for a kind of sorting of political identifications in different countries. So it comes to express, for instance, in France, a certain resistance to modernity, a resistance to liberal pluralism, a resistance to the French Revolution and everything it brought. Basically, people who are against those things become anti-Semitic. And that's true on both, I would say, the far left opponents of those things and the far right. So, basically the people more in the center, the liberal Republicans, are the ones who don't become anti-Semites in France. And I think that's more or less true in a lot of other contexts too. So I don't know if that answers what.
So, and can you see also different contexts in France itself? Because I'm thinking, for example, you've mentioned Algeria, and that is like a hotbed of anti-Semitism that originates perhaps from the settlers and sort of the granting of citizenship in 1870. I imagine that is different and similar to things that are happening in Paris. And Paris might be different than rural areas. So how do you kind of, when you do this contextualization, how do you kind of work within specific locations within France, which is also an empire this period?
Right. I mean, yeah, the Algeria case is very interesting because that was surprising to me. I mean, I knew it before I did the book, but I hadn't really thought about like why in Algeria were there the worst anti-Semitic riots, and also the worst anti-Semite in 19th century France, this guy Edouard Drummond, who wrote this best-selling book, La France Juive, Jewish France, in 1886, which really kind of sets the table for the Dreyfus Affair. He gets elected deputy from Algiers. And, even though he didn't live there, even, it's just because they were so anti-Semitic, but what's striking is it was not the Muslim population that was so anti-Semitic. It was the other the white European population that were the hardcore anti-Semites. So it's a very complicated legacy. And as you said, it's made more complicated by the French colonial policy there. So, just very briefly, but like when France conquers Algeria in 1830, there's a big population, obviously, of Muslims, but also a pretty big population of Jews, especially in the cities. And they're, up to like, 30 or 40% in some cities. So they're, a major force. And this is in 1830. So French Jews have full equal rights at that point. But the French colonial authorities don't give citizenship to the Jews at that point. They treat both the Jews and the Muslims as subjects, but not citizens. And the French Jews kind of advocate for the Algerian Jews over the course of the 19th century. They try to civilize them and make them more European, and there's a real kind of almost anti-Semitic discourse of French Jews towards, and a real colonialist discourse towards the Algerian Jews. And then in 1870, the French government, partly because the Minister of Justice in the Third Republic is Jewish, Adolphe Crémieux, and they wind up giving citizenship to the Jews, but not to the Muslims. And that creates all kinds of tensions between those two communities later. And, you know, it's a whole other story. So, you know.
And how do you, as a scholar, kind of navigate through these anti-Semitic publications? I mean, some of them are silly, but some of them kind of integrate into them, eugenics and social Darwinism, and some of them are more religious in nature, and it's the rise of racial theories. So when you look at as a scholar of literature, actually, and culture, when you look at anti-Semitic materials from France, how do you read them? What are you looking at them because at one point, I've been reading some of these things, but at one point it's like, okay, I'm not sure. But how do you do this kind of active deconstruction and learning something from this archive that kind of informs your story?
Yeah, it's right. Yeah, how do you force yourself to do that? I
Also,
think,
how do you contextualize them in a meaningful way?
yeah, I mean, I think partly what you do is you try to look for genealogies of ideas, I think. So you sort of see, okay, in La France Juive, for example, he's clearly borrowing certain tropes, and you can kind of, once you're really familiar, you see, oh, he's taking this from these very specific texts from the 1840s, for example. But then you see, oh, also he's doing a lot of new things too. And so that text is really important because he's kind of taking a kind of certain left-wing socialist anti-Semitism, but combining it with a new racializing discourse, but also some really old Catholic anti-Semitism thrown in. So, you start to see those those different streams, I would say, and that becomes interesting. But it's also really horrible, and you have to kind of look away at some point. And I can't be someone who just studies anti-Semitism. I find it too depressing.
So and just on that point, do you see now there's in kind of contemporary right-wing blogosphere, there's a lot of sort of resurgence of anti-Semitic theory, Jewish global dominations, and other things. Do you find any similarities between the Candace Owen, Tucker Carlson of today and the kind of material that you're reading around the Dreiser's affair and others, or it's completely this is more American context and this is French?
No, and in fact, Tucker Carlson is very influenced by the French context. So he's very influenced by the Great Replacement theory, comes from a contemporary French author, this guy Renaud Camus, and he's getting it from a whole tradition of French anti-Semitism. So there really is a kind of global circulation, I would say, of these ideas. And it's not that different from the kind of anti-Semitism that we saw during the Dreyfus Affair, which was happening. The 1890s were a time when there was a massive arrival of Eastern European Jews to Paris who not as many as came to the United States, but still, a fair number, and they tended to cluster in certain neighborhoods in Paris and were very noticeable. And this set off all kinds of fears of invasion, including by French, more acculturated French Jews who were, also sort of horrified by the Eastern European Jews. So, that's not that different, I think, from some of the, some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that we hear now. And of course, this great replacement theory is sort of blaming Jews for bringing in other immigrants. I mean, it's, you can see how it comes out of this xenophobic rhetoric going back to the 19th century.
Okay, last question about the discussing anti-Semites, and then we go to the other things. So the question is, in other contexts, you also see a strong gender component, right? So that is also typical of other racial discourses, right? So the Jew who tries to seduce the Aryan woman,
Okay.
the white woman, you see it in Germany, for example. Yeah, and the Dreyfus affair is about an officer. So there's something in the very famous moment where they take the military decorations.
Yeah, they rip he has to go through this horrible degradation ceremony where they rip his insignia off his uniform and break his sword.
But are there any other sort of noticeable gender components to this anti-Semitism, sort of the fear for the Christian family and others that we see in other sort of contexts?
Yeah, and other people have written on this. There's a whole book, I think, called something like The Dreyfus Affair and the Crisis of Masculinity, and it's by someone named Froth. So yes, I think that a lot of the there's a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric around the kind of feminization of the Jew and the sort of challenge that Jews, the kind of the deviation of Jews from a kind of white Christian manly ideal. And I think the fact that there were more and more Jews in the French military was these issues kind of really came to the surface. So Dreyfus was not an exception. There were something like 300 Jewish officers in the French army in the 1890s. So really quite a lot, given that the Jewish population was very small, under 1%. So they are, people like Drummond are constantly harping on the fact that Jews are unfit to serve in the army. They're all potential traitors. And there are these famous duels, actually, where these Jewish officers challenge. There's a duel, one of them challenges Drummond, and another one challenges this other anti-Semite, and the Jewish officer is killed. And so there are these performances of masculinity around the affair that are really interesting.
Okay, so moving to your other work about, historical novels and novelistic writings by Jews, like when I look at, again, the Middle East public sphere, these products travel quite extensively. So the historical novel, for example, becomes a hugely popular genre in Arabic, in Turkish. And then the novel itself is being translated into, novels like Les Miserables or The Mysteries of Paris are circulating in Arabic and in Turkish, for that matter, in Yiddish and Ladino.
Yeah.
And it might have to do also with sort of your own thinking about temporalities and the relationship between past, present, and future in France. French social theory is also circulating quite widely in the Middle East. So everybody's commenting on Benan's ideas about the Semites and the Aryans. They're very interested in his ideas of citizenship. Le Bon is very, very popular in work on social theory. And there's almost like it's similar a little bit to like how some of my undergraduate students feel the need to quote Foucault or something at particular moments, not so much today. So I was wondering, I have two questions about that. So first, what do you think made genres like, and you've written extensively about this, but like the historical novel and the novel so popular in France itself, so important to Jews? Or maybe you can give a few examples, and then again, can you hypothesize why this traveled so globally?
Yeah.
Like why do we have those other versions of these novels?
Yeah, so the historical novel was, one of the dominant literary genres of the 19th century in many different national literatures, but it really the pioneer of it is Walter Scott in English. And you think of a novel like Ivanhoe, which is really performing. So what I have said, but what lots of scholars have said, is that these historical novels are really useful vehicles for ideology. So they're the way that emergent nation states in the 19th century, especially after Waterloo, I would say, which is when Walter Scott becomes a global sensation. These in the kind of era of romantic nationalism, these different national literatures are using the historical novel to kind of work out issues of national identity. So in Ivanhoe, it's about the formation of England through the opposition between the Normans and the Saxons. And of course, they're both against the Jews, who are also very present in that novel. So the Jews wind up kind of being the kind of unifier through hatred, and also through kind of lust, because of course, the beautiful Jewess. That archetype really comes from that novel too. So what's interesting is that Jews wind up adopting this genre in a big way, and some of the first Jewish literature in the 19th century in French and German is and English actually are historical texts. And this is a kind of literature that the late Jonathan Hass, who I co-edited that book about the Jewish literature reader, he was a scholar of German literature. He wrote a great book about middlebrow Jewish literature. So it's this literature that was written for middle-class Jewish people in France and Germany and England and America. And these aren't great works of literature, but they're very ideologically interesting because they're basically written to kind of teach lessons and to kind of inculcate values that the writers wanted people to absorb. And and in different ways. So some of the first writer in French is a woman named Eugénie Foua, who was from the Sephardic community in Bordeaux, from a very elite family. And she writes these Jewish historical novels starting in the 1830s, but really to kind of preach like total actual assimilation through conversion. But then you start to get more scholarly versions that are influenced by the German Wissenschaft movement that are doing something very different. So I'm thinking someone like this guy, David Schornstein, who's writing them in the 1850s and 60s in France. And they're very complicated. So he writes these historical fictions like about most of them are about like horrible persecutions of Jews in the Middle Ages, where really they're like kind of cloak and dagger, almost like Alexandre Dumas kind of things with a lot of bloody tortures. And the point seems to be, I think, that Jews should basically give up all the negative features of Jewish culture that made them a ghettoized people in order to join the kind of mainstream and give up the kind of negative aspects of Jewish culture, including too much studying, but without surrendering their Jewish identity. And ultimately, I think that these novels, in an age when Jews are becoming more secularized and kind of losing their traditional Jewish religious identity, I think these historical novels, and this is to answer your question, why they're so popular, I think, for Jews, especially, but not only for Jews, is that they substitute something else as a basis for Jewish identity, and that's history. So they become a way, Jews are kind of encouraged to feel Jewish because they have this past and this sort of history of suffering that becomes a kind of point of identification, I think very similar to the way that the Holocaust and Holocaust literature functions for Jews now. So I think that the precursor to that was these historical novels in the 19th century. And that's true in France and Germany, but it's not surprising to me that it's also true in the Middle East.
In the Middle East, it's interesting. I mean, there's the Zionist interest in sort of the Bible and the mythical heroes like the judges, and it works in both poetry and prose. If you think about Tchaikovsky and his interest in the Bible, very the Zionist poets and his ballad and so forth. But in the Arab world, I think it's interesting because again, late 19th century, they're already reading Dumayan translation, they're already reading the Mizrahi translation, and then they produce these historical novels which are precisely about nationalism. So it's the antiquity and it's the glorious Semitic antiquity. But there the Jew plays a very positive role. So there's a novel, for example, that was written in the early 20th century by a guy who was deeply in Farhan too, who was very influenced by the life of Jesus by Renan. And so he decides to write a novel about like a guy called Ilya, like his Jesus that lives in the beginning of the Muslim conquest of Palestine. And of course, he falls in love with the Jewish woman, and they talk a lot about religion and how they share the same religion. There's a lot about the myth of Andalus and Spain, and the Jew there is more loyal to the Muslims. So it's interesting how it plays out.
And I would just say, to sort of mention someone who recently died, but Olga Borovaya, who I was talking to Ken Moss about, who was the big scholar of Ladino Jewish writing in Ladino. And she really studied brilliantly the way these French novels were rewritten in Ladino, but often like completely changed to become these didactic texts. So like, Madame Bovary, but it's rewritten in Ladino to be, don't cheat on your husband. So it's, yeah. Yeah.
So, okay, last question. Because you guys will have your question. So in the Middle East, one of the tensions that you see with respect to French culture is that on the one hand, there's a great degree of admiration for what Paris looks like in its libraries and the French Revolution, and when there was a constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire, they imagined themselves based on the ideas of the French Revolution, and people study French and they want to go to French schools and so forth. They write in French. But at the same time, there's sort of this deep disappointment by France as the colonizer, by, starting with Napoleon in Egypt, and then Algeria, and then the other protectorates in North Africa. And so I wonder if you see the same kind of duality with the Jews, that on the one hand, of France, that on the one hand you're deeply attracted to the culture that ultimately rejects you, and whether there's like, and whether we can think on a higher level about, and this is something that Orit also wrote about kind of the connection between Jews and colonized subjects, thinking about this French concept.
Yeah, definitely. I think you can. It makes me think of this, one of the French Jewish writers who I studied, this guy Ben Levy, that was his pen name. His real name was Gocho Vey. He happened to have been the great uncle of Proust. But in the 1840s, he wrote these amazing short stories in the French Jewish newspaper. And one of them, this makes me think of, it's called the March 17th Decree. And this was the decree by Napoleon that basically said that Jews in Alsace um, couldn't it was basically saying that Jews in Alsace didn't have to or non-Jews didn't have to pay money back to Jews, basically. So it was a complete violation of equality before the law established by the French Revolution. It was really a shocking backtracking on Jewish emancipation. The decree also said that only Jews were forbidden to hire a replacement for army service. So Jews had to, other people could hire someone to take their place, Jews couldn't. So the story is about a young Alsatian boy whose family is ruined by the decree because his father was, lent money. He was forced into the army. He was taken prisoner during the Napoleonic Wars, was spent 20 years in a Siberian labor camp, and comes back to Paris. At the moment when they're creating the Invalides and creating this big shrine to Napoleon, and he can't get over his hatred of Napoleon, but he's sort of struggling because he understands the glory, but kind of can't become part of it because of Napoleon's sort of ambivalent attitude towards Jews. And I think this story really epitomizes what you're saying. I collect it in that reader I mentioned because it's an amazing story of exactly that. I think Jews felt really conflicted in France. I think in the main, they were very, very grateful to France for emancipating Jews, but there were also these darker moments, including that March 17th decree of Napoleon, and some other ones too. So I think it's a fraught history that only got more fraught, and I think that French Jews now feel that ambivalence, intensely, I think. Both, this is a country that both emancipated them, but then turned them over to the Nazis. So, you know, yeah.
Well, on that note, let's open it up for questions because I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions yourselves. And yeah, the floor is open, and I see a question in the back.
Yes, different ways of this. One way is that individual characters make a huge difference. Another way is that it's the forces of economics and other things that are forcing things to happen. So in particular, Edward Drummond and Zola, without them, would we have this affair?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's certainly not the same kind of affair, maybe something else, would have still happened, but it certainly took the form it did because of them. And I think, it is important to study individuals in history, not just social and economic forces, because they do have an enormous role. I mean, it certainly was Zola was a huge hero of the affair, and as was this anti-Semitic French officer named Picard, who happened to have been, he was an avowed anti-Semite, but an honest guy. He's the one who discovered the proof that Dreyfus was innocent. And he was willing to pay the price for it. He got sent on a kind of mission to go get killed, and it's not clear what would have happened if it hadn't been for him and his particular honesty. So I think that's definitely true.
Thank you so much for coming to present and for writing all this that you've written. I have two questions about sort of the legacies for the Dreyfus Affair for contemporary understandings of anti-Semitism. The first is like from reading your work. I understand Dreyfus was fabulously wealthy, so I'm curious what the legacy is for sort of Jewish economic power, not just political power, not just sort of cultural assimilation and that. And then secondly, this kind of asks about global circulation, perhaps everywhere but the Middle East. I'm curious about its circulation in Catholic thought and sort of like whether thinking through the French response as conditioned by Catholicism can help us see the responses to or the legacy of the Dreyfus Affair in places like Latin America, elsewhere in Europe that sort of looks at a different transnational now.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say like the Dreyfuses were fabulously wealthy. I would say they were wealthy, and so like they supposedly spent like 1 million francs on this, which is a lot of money. And there's no doubt that it was because of their wealth that they were able to turn this into an affair, and I say in the book that, how many falsely accused people do we just not ever hear about because their families don't have the resources to and the cultural capital, I would say, to be able to turn it into an affair, so that's definitely true. And that gets used against them. So that's one of the big things that the anti-Semites say is that the Jews are using their economic power to make this into an affair. And that's the Rothschilds are in a very strange place. So like they want to help, but they also don't want to be seen helping because that would just feed anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The anti-Semites were saying there was a syndicate of wealthy, powerful Jews who were, working behind the scenes and controlling the French government. So the last thing the Rothschilds wanted was that. So it was, very complicated. So yeah, that Catholic. So the Dreyfus Affair was not a shining moment for the Catholic Church because they basically are very, very anti-Dreyfus are. And this, with some key exceptions of individual Catholics. And so, one of the main ones is this prominent writer and poet named Charles Péguy, who is a kind of important Dreyfus art and who writes an important book about the Dreyfus Affair afterwards, called Our Youth, and that he's trying to understand it from a kind of Catholic theological perspective, which is really interesting. But also the affair has really dramatic consequences for the Catholic Church because what happens is that the left takes power as a result of the Dreyfus Affair. And the main thing they do is they push through the separation of church and state. So the Combe Law of 1905 is the direct outcome of the Dreyfus Affair. And that is horrible for the Catholic Church. And I mean, and so that it's actually bad for the Jews also in a certain way, because it's, before that, rabbis were on the state payroll. That's one of the things that makes France really unique is that as of 1830, not all, but Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic clergy are paid by the state from 1830 until 1905. So that changes. So yeah.
It's sort of stunning that you felt that no one had approached this from the lens of anti-Semitic Jewish, or sort of how can that be? It just seems ridiculous, and I guess one place where it may have centered is this assimilation idea.
Yeah.
But I'm curious what you think. How did it serve the previous people, such as Orit and other people who looked at it, how did it serve them to take out this this lens?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that if other people didn't talk about it because they did, but and, every book about the Dreyfus Affair talks about anti-Semitism. You can't not talk about it. But very few people make it the center of the discussion. So that's what I kind of wanted to say. And for Arendt, it's really key, as I said, to her argument about both about where Jews went wrong by trying to assimilate, and also to her argument about the function of anti-Semitism, basically in 19th century France. And so, it's it's hard to generalize, but I think that the reason I think that people get the anti-Semitism, or what they don't see, I think sometimes, is that first of all, as I said before, that the case is interesting to people because it brings to the surface the Jewish question, basically. So, the Jewish question was asking, what is the place of Jews in the modern nation state? Should they be considered equal citizens? On what terms exactly do Jews belong in modern states? And this was a question that was being asked all over the world, but especially in Western European democracies where there were more and more Jewish immigrants who were suddenly arriving and people didn't really know what to do. And the Dreyfus Affair really brought that question to the surface. So that's one of the arguments I make in the book, that it was. So other scholars have talked about it in similar ways, but without the anti-Semitism, by saying that the Dreyfus Affair was important because it was a test case for liberal democracy. That's the more common line, I would say. So, what the Dreyfus Affair was about was, do all people have the right to equal justice under the law, even when, or do all individuals have the right to equal justice, even when that justice is going against kind of national or military, desires? And so that's, I would say, the more conventional view. And I was trying to say it's actually also really an important case because of the Jewish question.
I had a quick question about, one of the things I was curious about, you wrote this for a series, for the Jewish Love series. Would you have written about it any differently had you written this for a French audience? And then would you have written it any differently if you wrote it for specifically a French Jewish audience?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, definitely I did lean into the Jewish question because it was for the Jewish Lives series, although they didn't say I had to do that. And in fact, all they said was that you're supposed to have an original take on it. But there are many books in the series that they're all different, and some are very Jewish and some really aren't so much. And so yes, I probably did emphasize the Jewishness. It's interesting because other books of mine have been translated into French, and this one wasn't. And I did approach my editor from my last book, from the Right to Difference book, and basically they, and I understood this. He was like, there are too many, the market is too crowded with Dreyfus books in France, and also I do kind of tell the whole story of the affair in a way that probably French people don't need as much. Although I don't know, there are some French people here. I don't know. I do ask French people how much do you know about the Dreyfus Affair? And it's surprising, they know about it, but they don't necessarily know all the details. So it's not clear that you know, the average French person is reading all of those books about Dreyfus, but yeah, you know, I didn't really press too hard, but it would have been interesting to see what the reaction to the book was in France. It's interesting, another book in the series by the big French Jewish historian Pierre Birnbaum, he wrote the Léon Blum book in the series, which is really good, I think. And that they was translated. And he does a similar kind of thing. So he also, I think, really emphasizes Bloom's Jewishness in that book.
Thank you so much. I would like to hear a bit more about French intellectuals within the origins of Zionist movement, such as Bernard Lazare, Jacob Behar, who wrote Anti-Egoism in Zion, like the famous Utopia, and they very quick disappointment in a way separation between French Jewish perspective and German and East European Jewish perspective that navigated the movement to different directions.
Yeah, I mean, it's really notable that the leading early Zionists who so I'm thinking of Herzl, but also Max Nordau, and they're obviously Central European, but they were living in France at this time, and kind of Nordau was really a French intellectual in many ways, and he, I think, is responsible for a lot of the misunderstandings of the affair, partly because I think it's at the Second Zionist Congress, he gets up there and gives these speeches that saying that there's not a single French Jew willing to do anything to help Dreyfus. And that the French Jews are just only concerned with their own assimilation, and this proves that we need, and Arendt pretty much takes that exactly word for word. And really ever since then, French Jews have gotten a really bad rap for having completely failed, the tests. And this, I show in the book that this is really not true. In fact, all of the early Dreyfusards were Jews. And the main one is Bernard Lazare, who you refer to, who's a really fascinating, I don't have time to go into it, but he was this anarchist who wrote a book about anti-Semitism before the affair that is vaguely anti-Semitic, but kind of basically blaming anti-Semitism on the Eastern European Jews, and it's bad. But then he had a complete kind of conversion to Zionism during the affair, and he's one of the kind of heroic figures during the Dreyfus affair, where he writes an early book exposing the cover-up and the conspiracy. And he had just a very interesting itinerary. And so, other French Jew, I mean, Léon Blum is another interesting French Jewish intellectual who, before he becomes the first Jewish prime minister, he also, is a very interesting intellectual figure, and he really is formed also during the Dreyfus affair. And he also is responsible for blaming not just the French Jews, he blames Dreyfus. So he has a famous line, and I'll stop because we're running out of time, but he writes a book called Souvenirs sur l'affaire, so Memories of the Affair, in 1935, so right when Dreyfus dies and when Nazism is taking shape, and he wants to kind of, like Arendt, I think, awaken French Jews to the danger. And it says terrible things about Dreyfus. He says, if Dreyfus hadn't been Dreyfus, would he even have been a Dreyfusard? He said, meaning he was just an army guy. He probably didn't even understand what was at stake in his case. He probably was a right-wing guy, which really one of the big things that I try to do in my book is to show that is totally untrue. So Dreyfus was himself a very noble guy who totally understood what was at stake in his case. Wrote about it very movingly, and so.
Last question over there.
Hi, thank you so much for everyone for your presentation
Yeah.
here. So I was really interested when you were talking about income benefits and functioning as a code, especially on both the right and the left, specifically because so many of the drivers are defend the drivers and defend the position of most peers in the name of a sort of universalism that has a complex relationship and simulation of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Especially, I understand, the Catholic right wing associated with anti-Semitism, but I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on how anti-Semitism functions as a code on the left in what era and how it's related to the French universalism that the architects type out.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's a big complicated question, but the quick answer is, that beginning in the early 19th century, like the two kind of like proto-socialist movements, or the kind of, people starting to think about the social question. So you have the Saint-Simonians, who are a lot of Jews and a lot of converted Jews, who are kind of pro-business and kind of think business, like industrialization is going to be the answer. And then you have the Fourierists, the disciples of Charles Fourier, who are opposed to the Saint-Simonians and are kind of anti-Semitic, or actually very blatantly anti-Semitic. So Fourier himself is pretty blatantly anti-Semitic, but then his disciples become really anti-Semitic, including in the 1840s, this guy Toussenel, who writes this book called Les Juifs Rois de l'époque, so the Jews kings of the age, where from a far left kind of proto-socialist viewpoint, he's arguing that Jewish capitalists are turning France, it's a new feudalism, basically, and they've now subjugated the French people, through their, nefarious, capitalistic. So that tradition, and when I was mentioning that, like when you read Drummond in the 1880s, you see like the legacy of these earlier writers, so especially Toussenel. But Marx himself is in France in the 1840s and writes on the Jewish question, where he says Judaism is a religion of huckstering, and he's part of that kind of left-wing tradition. Oh, and then, the main person is Proudhon, Proudhon, who is the guy famous for saying property is theft, who's, a big left-wing kind of proto-socialist thinker and kind of mutualist thinker in the 1840s, and he's violently anti-Semitic. I mean, he actually calls for the expulsion of Jews from France in the 1840s. So there is this strong far left kind of, but it's coming at it. I think it's similar to the right wing. They're both kind of reactions to modernity and reactions to the rise of capitalism and liberal pluralism. They're both sort of against that, but from the two different sides, and anti-Semitism serves both of them.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for everything. To add that I wish your book was translated into Hebrew, because in Israel you only get like the version